Officer Cole Renner wore his badge like armor, using it to intimidate, control, and walk away clean. Marcus Hale knew his kind. Cops who saw black men as easy targets, who twisted routine stops into acts of dominance, then buried the truth behind reports no one questioned. But Marcus wasn't just another man behind the wheel. He was the director of internal affairs, calm, composed, and fully aware of what was coming. He didn't argue. He didn't resist. He let Renner do what he'd always done. And when he did, there would be no way to spin it, no way to bury it. This time, justice wouldn't just be demanded. It would be inevitable. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the layered clouds that hung low over the city skyline, casting long, muted reflections across the slick streets, still glistening from an earlier rain. The air carried that faint metallic tang that lingered after a storm. And as traffic thinned and the day began to surrender to evening, the mood of the city shifted, calmer, but no less watchful. Marcus Hale guided his black sedan steadily through the main boulevard, the faint hum of smooth jazz weaving through the cabin like a thread of composure, its mellow saxophone solo softening the edge of a long and exhausting meeting he had just left behind. He was in no rush. His hands rested lightly on the wheel, posture upright, gaze calm, allowing the rhythm of the road and the music to unwind the tension buried beneath his tailored suit. The day had been another closed-door session with the state's oversight panel, hours of subtle power plays, thinly veiled excuses, and bureaucratic resistance masquerading as concern. These were the conversations that never made headlines. The quiet battles Marcus fought not in courtrooms or public hearings, but in conference rooms sealed off from accountability. As Director of Internal Affairs, Marcus had long since mastered the art of silence, of measured responses, and perfectly weighed decisions. He had learned when to speak and when to simply observe, when to press forward, and when to gather more rope. But even the most disciplined man could feel weariness settle in his bones after hearing the same evasions repeated by people sworn to enforce the law. As the traffic lights cycled in rhythmic patterns and the downtown stretch began to narrow toward older, quieter streets, Marcus noticed a patrol car merging behind him. At first, he thought nothing of it. City cops drifted in and out of lanes all the time. But after 2 turns and a right signal that the cruiser also mirrored, his eyes shifted to the rearview mirror with quiet certainty. The police car was following, not aggressively, not with sirens or flashing urgency, just close. Closer than necessary. The lights came on 2 blocks later. Red and blue flashed across the polished dash and windshield, bouncing off the rear view and flooding the cabin in artificial urgency. Marcus reached calmly for the dial, lowering the volume of the music without a word. He signaled his turn, eased the car to the curb beneath a tall streetlight that hadn't yet flickered on, and shifted the gear into park. The rain-soaked pavement mirrored the cruiser's lights in long, jagged streaks, and for a moment, everything was still. He kept his hands on the wheel, palms open, fingers relaxed but visible. He did not frown. He did not sigh. This wasn't new. What mattered now was how it was handled. Through the mirror, he watched the patrol car's driver door open and a man step out with deliberate pacing. Stocky frame, neatly pressed uniform, squared shoulders. Officer Cole Renner. Marcus recognized him almost instantly, not from memory alone, but from documentation, a name that had crossed his desk twice in the past year. Excessive force complaints, dismissed without discipline. Use of authority reviews, quietly settled. No charges, no internal consequences. Just warnings and sealed evaluations. Renner had the posture of someone who had never been told no and had never needed to justify his badge. The officer approached the driver's side with slow, theatrical purpose, each step calculated to convey dominance. When he reached the window, He rapped his knuckle twice against the glass, curt and mechanical. Marcus pressed the button, lowering the window halfway, his expression unchanged. "License and registration," Renner said, voice dry and perfunctory, eyes scanning Marcus with the impatience of someone who had already decided how this would go. "Certainly, officer," Marcus replied with practiced ease. "May I ask the reason for the stop?" "You didn't come to a complete stop at the last sign," Renner answered, without hesitation, without pause, and without concern for the truth. There had been no stop sign, only a green light 2 intersections back. But Marcus didn't correct him. "Not yet. My license is in my inner jacket pocket," he said. "I'll retrieve it slowly, if that's all right." Renner said nothing, but his body shifted ever so slightly. Marcus caught the movement, the subtle repositioning of weight, the unspoken tension around the holster on his hip. Keeping his gestures controlled, Marcus reached inside his jacket and retrieved his ID and registration, holding them out without sudden movement. Renner accepted the documents without acknowledgement, glancing down, then up again. "You from around here?" Renner asked, eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes," Marcus replied simply. "This your vehicle?" "It is." There was a pause, the kind of silence that stretched not because there was nothing to say, but because the speaker was deciding how far he could go. Renner squinted at the ID again, then at Marcus, as if trying to detect a flaw in the story that didn't exist. "You work for the state?" he asked, tone shifting, not curious, not suspicious, but slightly annoyed. "I do." Renner's face tightened just a touch. "Step out of the vehicle for me." Marcus remained still for a moment, then turned his head slowly. "Is there a specific reason for that request? You got a problem following orders?" "No," Marcus said evenly. "I'm simply asking for clarity." The muscles in Renner's jaw tensed. "Step out of the vehicle, now." Marcus sighed through his nose, not with irritation, but with the quiet resignation of a man who had hoped today might be uneventful. He unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out onto the pavement with measured calm. He stood tall, hands loose at his sides, his suit immaculate against the muted afternoon air. Across the street, a pedestrian had slowed his walk. A phone was raised discreetly, its lens catching the tension rising like steam. Renner's voice didn't change pitch, but his stance shifted with the rigid weight of a man who had already made up his mind, who had already decided how this moment would end before it had even begun. His boots stepped forward with a deliberate crunch against the wet asphalt, shrinking the space between them in quiet, menacing increments. "I said, turn around. Hands on the hood," he repeated, each word clipped and certain, not a suggestion, but a declaration of control, meant to remind Marcus where the power supposedly sat in this moment. Marcus did not move at first, and it wasn't hesitation that held him still. It was precision. Every breath was intentional. Every second was measured. His eyes stayed locked on Renner's, not with defiance, but with a composure that unsettled men like him. Calm wasn't what Renner wanted. Obedience was. Fear was. A lowered head and mumbled apology was. But all he saw in Marcus was steadiness. "For what cause?" Marcus asked again, his voice even, deliberate, and free from the cracks that usually surfaced in people when confronted with sudden authority. There was no quiver, no aggression, just a man demanding clarity in a system that rarely offered it. Renner's expression hardened. "Don't play smart," he said, stepping in further, now close enough that Marcus could see the faded creases near his holster, the sweat collecting just beneath the brim of his brow. "You match the description. Black male, dark vehicle, suspicious behavior, end of story." "And what specific behavior did you observe that qualifies as suspicious?" Marcus replied, his hands still visible, his stance relaxed, but his words gaining edge. "Driving the speed limit? Using my turn signal? Coming from a business district? You raising your voice at me?" Renner snapped, but there was a tremor under the surface now. Barely detectable, but there. Not fear, not yet, but uncertainty. The kind that came when a man used a script he expected to work. And it didn't. I haven't raised my voice, Marcus answered, tone still even, still quiet. I asked you to explain your stop. I don't have to explain anything to someone who doesn't follow basic instructions. Renner fired back, his voice now beginning to rise, fueled not by authority, but by frustration. Step around the car. Place your hands on the hood. Marcus let a breath pass through his nose, almost imperceptibly. He didn't want to give this man anything that could be read as resistance, but he also wasn't about to fold into submission just to preserve someone else's illusion of control. Slowly, he turned, taking the 2 steps toward the front of his vehicle, placing his palms on the cool, rain-slicked hood with the patience of a man who had seen far worse than an angry patrol officer. The metal beneath his fingers hummed faintly with the warmth of the engine, but the air around him was charged, each breath sharper, each sound more vivid. Behind him, he heard the unmistakable rustle of a duty belt shifting, the coarse breathing of Renner stepping into position. And then came the shove. Hard, deliberate. Marcus's chest hit the hood with a jolt, not from clumsiness, but force. Renner's hand pushed his upper back down, while the other began an unnecessarily aggressive pat-down, his movements more violent than technical, more about humiliation than security. The sounds of his hands dragging over the tailored fabric of Marcus's jacket were harsh, erratic. It was the kind of search that left a message, not results. "You got anything sharp?" Renner muttered. "No," Marcus said. "Drugs? No. Weapon? No. Anything illegal you want to confess?" "There's nothing to find," Marcus answered, voice steady, eyes fixed on the reflection in the windshield. "You're searching because you can, not because you have a reason." That line touched something raw in Renner. The hand that was pressing against Marcus's hip paused, then clenched. "You're real bold for someone in your position," Renner said, his voice no longer calm, but tinged with the kind of anger that had nothing to do with the moment and everything to do with history. "And what position do you believe I'm in?" Marcus asked. Renner laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Let me guess. Some non-profit worker. Maybe a professor? No, you're probably one of those civil types, always talking rights, always telling cops how to do our jobs." "I haven't told you how to do your job," Marcus replied without turning his head. "I've only asked you to justify your actions. You don't get to make demands," Renner hissed, and his grip tightened again. Across the street, the movement began. A young man wearing headphones paused mid-step and slowly removed them, watching with narrowed eyes. Further down the sidewalk, a woman getting into her car stopped, turned, and pulled out her phone. The stillness of the moment began to fracture under the weight of observation. This was no longer a private encounter. It was becoming a public moment, whether Renner liked it or not. Renner glanced toward the corner of his vision and saw the shift. He saw the man with the phone, the posture that said, "We're watching you now," and that only pushed him further into anger. "You think having people watch changes what I can do?" Renner asked, louder now. "You think some camera gives you power?" "No," Marcus replied, his breath still calm. "I think it reveals who has abused it. You don't know who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Renner paced a few steps away from him now, hands on his hips, mouth working through words he hadn't chosen yet. He looked at Marcus, then the bystanders, then back again. He was unraveling, not from confusion, but from being confronted with someone who didn't flinch. "You're a smart guy, huh?" he said, voice carrying down the block. "Real calm, real polished. Got answers for everything." "I've lived through this too many times to be surprised," Marcus said. "You act like you're special. I act like I know the law." That pushed Renner over the edge. He stepped back in, now inches from Marcus, his hand hovering near the holster again. He didn't draw, but his fingers rested against the latch, letting it be seen, letting the possibility hang there like a threat. "You keep running your mouth," he said, voice dropping low and dangerous, "and you'll see what happens when I stop being patient." "I'm not asking for patience," Marcus said, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm asking for accountability." The silence that followed felt heavy, pressing down from all directions. A light drizzle began again, soft, more of a mist than a storm, but it coated the street in a fresh shimmer, reflecting the tension like light off a blade. "You keep testing me," Renner said through his teeth, "and you'll regret it." "I'm not testing you," Marcus said clearly, with no change in tone. "I'm warning you." Renner took a single step back, and for a brief, chilling second, the world seemed to hold its breath. The weight of the moment shifted sharply, dragging the late afternoon light into something colder, something harder to breathe through. The sun hung low now, caught behind a thick veil of darkening clouds that soaked the city in gray and gold, shadows stretching across the pavement like silent spectators. The air, still damp from the earlier rain, carried no wind, no birdsong, only the rising hush of disbelief as Officer Cole Renner raised his service weapon and aimed it squarely at Marcus Hale's chest. For a moment, the world held its breath. The barrel hovered inches from the center of Marcus's body, unmoving, unwavering, a straight line drawn from one man's paranoia to another man's heartbeat. The crowd across the street froze, phones still recording, fingers tightening around plastic cases. Someone whispered, "Oh no," while a car further down the block crept to a stop. The driver's wide eyes locked on the unfolding disaster. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't step back. His hands remained visible, slightly raised, calm, open, not in surrender, but in clarity. His voice, when it came, was smooth and deliberate, cutting clean through the tension like a scalpel through scar tissue. "My name is Marcus Hale," he said, louder now, letting the syllables carry. "Director of Internal Affairs for the State Department of Justice." Renner's eyes twitched, but the gun didn't lower. "I oversee law enforcement conduct compliance," Marcus continued. "Badge number 10267. Cross-agency clearance. I report directly to the Commissioner." "Don't you move!" Renner barked, louder now, as if drowning Marcus's words could silence their truth. "Keep your hands where I can see them." "I haven't moved," Marcus said. "I haven't threatened you. You've escalated this without cause." "Shut up!" Renner shouted, voice cracking now, something wild and desperate unraveling in his tone. "You think I'm gonna fall for that? You think saying you're some big shot gives you a pass? It gives you a warning," Marcus replied, his voice sharp now, the calm no longer gentle but edged with steel. "You are seconds away from ending your career, and you don't even know it." Renner's grip tightened on the weapon. His stance widened. His mouth twitched, as if trying to decide between a sneer and a shout. "You're lying. You're trying to manipulate the situation. I don't know who you are, and I don't care. My credentials are in the inner pocket of my jacket," Marcus said carefully. "You can retrieve them yourself, or you can call dispatch and verify my name. Either way, you'll see this isn't a bluff." "You think I don't know your type?" Renner hissed, stepping forward slightly. "You dress nice, talk smooth, think you're above everyone. But I see what's really happening here. You're pushing me. You're trying to make me the story. You made yourself the story the moment you drew your weapon on a man who did nothing but ask you a question," Marcus replied, and this time the words landed hard enough to make Renner flinch. The crowd on the sidewalk had thickened. A woman was openly crying. A man whispered into his phone. The air between Marcus and Renner pulsed with heat and distance, like a wire stretched so tight it could no longer bear its own weight. One wrong movement, one twitch, and it would snap. "I'm warning you," Renner growled. "One more word and I'll—" "Do what?" Marcus asked. That stopped everything. Even the street lamp above them flickered. Renner didn't answer, and in his silence, something shifted behind his eyes. Something raw and exposed, like a mask falling away. There was no more authority. No more control. Just panic disguised as posture. And in that sliver of time, Marcus saw it clearly. Renner was beyond reason. And now, for the first time, Marcus felt it too. Not anger, not pride, but danger. Real, immediate danger. Not the slow, gnawing kind of danger that came with institutional racism or buried reports. This was the kind of danger that came with a finger too close to a trigger, a voice too loud to hear sense, a man so deep in his own lies he couldn't see daylight anymore. Marcus's eyes dropped, not in submission, but calculation. He could see the trembling in Renner's knuckles now, the red tinge to his face, the tightness around his mouth. Renner was seconds from making a decision that couldn't be undone, and Marcus couldn't afford to be patient anymore. In one smooth motion, controlled and lightning quick, Marcus stepped forward, his body angling to the side just enough to throw off Renner's aim. His left hand shot out, slapping the inside of Renner's wrist, pushing the weapon upward as his right shoulder dropped into Renner's midsection. The officer stumbled, his arm twisting, body jerking backward in surprise as Marcus stepped in again, this time catching the gun hand in both arms and locking it tight against his chest. Renner fought back, swinging with his free hand, but Marcus ducked the blow, twisting sharply as his foot swept Renner's leg from under him. They hit the pavement hard, Renner first, back slamming into the wet asphalt with a dull, bone-jarring thud. The weapon skidded away, spinning toward the curb, just out of reach. Marcus rolled with the motion, not giving Renner space to recover. He pinned him quickly, one knee braced against the officer's forearm, the other pressing lightly to his ribs. Renner struggled, thrashed once, but the fight was gone. Not physically, he still moved, but the moment of dominance had passed, and both of them knew it. Marcus held the position without striking. He didn't yell. He didn't gloat. He simply stayed there, breathing steadily, making sure the man beneath him knew who had made the choice. "You aimed a weapon at an unarmed man," Marcus said, his voice calm again, though now heavy with authority that couldn't be denied. "And now you'll answer for it. You're finished." Renner spat from the ground, his voice shaking with rage and desperation as rain mist clung to his face. "You assaulted an officer." Marcus leaned down slowly, his expression unreadable, calm radiating from him like heat from stone. His voice was measured, but sharp enough to slice through every lie and deflection. "So did you." Renner's eyes narrowed with fury. With a sudden burst of energy, he twisted beneath Marcus, one hand wrenching free from beneath the pressure of his pinned arm. He lashed out violently, elbow catching Marcus's ribs with a thud. It wasn't precise, just raw, panicked aggression, but it was enough to force Marcus to shift. The crowd gasped. Marcus reacted instantly, rolling off the officer's torso and onto one knee in a practiced defensive maneuver. He raised his arms just in time to catch Renner's follow-up strike, an erratic punch that lacked aim but carried the weight of humiliation. Marcus absorbed the impact on his forearm, then stepped back, giving ground not because he was losing, but because he was calculating. Renner scrambled to his feet, soaked and furious, hands clenched, mouth foaming with curses. "You don't get to put your hands on me!" he shouted, pointing wildly as if his voice alone could restore control. "You don't get to fight me like you're the law." "I didn't fight you," Marcus said coldly, his chest rising and falling as the adrenaline tightened in his veins. "I stopped you from killing someone." Renner charged. Marcus didn't hesitate. He pivoted, sidestepped the tackle, caught Renner's right arm mid-motion, and with a sharp twist, redirected the momentum, slamming Renner back toward the hood of the cruiser. The metal echoed from the impact. Marcus followed through, sweeping one leg behind the officer's knee and collapsing him to the ground in a single controlled motion. Rain splashed around them. Renner hit the pavement again with a grunt, and this time Marcus didn't let him twist free. Kneeling behind him, he applied a tactical joint lock, grabbing Renner's wrist and folding his arm up and back until the tension immobilized his shoulder. The crowd across the street had grown larger, all eyes glued to the scene. A chorus of voices rose at once. "Is that all on video?" someone asked aloud. "Bro, I'm live right now," Devin muttered, holding his phone with both hands, His voice hushed but urgent. "This is streaming to like 4,000 people. They're blowing up my chat. Everyone's watching this go down. You get his badge number? Got it all. Everything. Start to finish." Marcus pressed Renner's arm slightly higher. "Do not move again," he warned, his voice not loud but filled with unmistakable command. "You're disarmed. You're restrained. Make one more aggressive move, and I will respond with the same control I've used so far." "Control?" Renner hissed, panting beneath him. "You're gonna regret this. I swear it." "I already regret letting it go this far," Marcus said. "But you made sure I didn't have a choice." He scanned the area quickly, eyes sharp and alert. The service weapon Renner had drawn was still lying near the gutter, partially obscured by a wet plastic bag blowing in the wind. Marcus kept his weight on Renner's back with one knee as he reached out and dragged the gun toward him using the edge of his foot. Once it was in reach, he picked it up, checked that the safety was on, then stepped back and used Renner's shoulder radio. He pressed the button. "Unit 417, requesting immediate backup," Marcus said into the mic, his voice crisp, professional, unshaken. "Officer involved in use of force confrontation. Suspect is restrained. Weapon has been secured. I am Director Marcus Hale. Repeat, Director Hale. Credentials available for confirmation. Location is East 49th and Harper, just south of the light." Static crackled back. "Copy that. Stand by. Director Hale, did you say?" Marcus released the button without answering. Behind him, Renner groaned, still writhing against the hold, but making no progress. The power he once wielded had drained from his body, his face twisted in disbelief and shame, like a man waking from a dream that turned against him halfway through. "You think people are going to believe your version?" he spat, voice muffled against the pavement. "You think that crowd matters? You think those phones mean anything?" "I think this time," Marcus said quietly, "they do." Within moments, the distant cry of sirens pierced through the still air. Flashing blue and white lights approached fast from the north. Tires screeched as two patrol cars pulled in beside them, doors swinging open. Officers emerged, weapons drawn, but they hesitated when they saw the scene. A restrained officer on the ground, the suspect holding the badge. And then came the voice that broke the tension. "Stand down!" Sergeant Lena Ortega stepped out of her cruiser, her black hair pulled tightly back beneath her cap. Her eyes locked immediately on Marcus. She didn't flinch. She didn't question. She already knew what had happened. "It's Director Hale," she said to the stunned officers around her. "He's clean. That weapon wasn't his." "About time," Marcus said, stepping back and allowing the nearest officer to take Renner from the ground. Ortega moved toward him. "You all right?" Marcus nodded. "Better than I should be." The officers retrieved the weapon, secured it in an evidence bag, and placed Renner in cuffs. The officer's face was red, bruised, soaked in both rain and shame. He shouted again, his words wild and meaningless now. "This is political. He jumped me. He set this up." Ortega didn't look at him. She turned to Marcus. "We'll get statements at the precinct. You have the footage?" "I don't," Marcus said, glancing toward Devon. "But he does." Devon stepped forward, lowering his phone just slightly. "I got everything, ma'am." From the first moment he pulled over. "Live-streamed the whole thing." "Good," she said. "We're going to need that." As Renner was led to the cruiser, hands cuffed behind his back, yelling about lawsuits and revenge, the scene grew quiet again. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring as they walked away, some still whispering about what they'd witnessed. Marcus stood still, unmoved, the streetlight catching the lines of his face, and the water beading on his jacket. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. By sunrise, the city was no longer quiet. The footage had spread faster than even the sirens the night before. What began as a live stream from a bystander named Devon Knox had been clipped, subtitled, reshared, and dissected by thousands within hours. Before dawn, it was on every major social platform, labeled with words like police misconduct, racial profiling, and heroic restraint. By mid-morning, national news anchors were reading Marcus Hale's name aloud in prime time. Director of Internal Affairs involved in controversial traffic stop. Civilian disarms officer in self-defense. Turns out to be DOJ official. Justice turns on the badge. Who is Marcus Hale? There was no hiding now. The video began with the flashing lights, the quiet stop. The moment Marcus rolled down his window, it built slowly, but each moment escalated with perfect clarity. The audience didn't need narration. They could hear Renner's tone, feel the aggression seep into his voice. They could see Marcus's calm, the way he never raised his hands in anything but visible compliance. The dialogue, the tension, the gun being drawn, the takedown, it was all there. Unfiltered, uninterrupted, captured from the very first flicker of abuse to the moment backup arrived. It was, in many ways, the perfect storm, and the department knew it. By 10 that morning, the city's official communications office released a brief, sterile statement. The incident involving one of our officers and a state official is currently under internal review. No further comment will be made until the investigation is complete. No names were mentioned. No details acknowledged. No apology offered. But the damage had already taken root. Protesters gathered outside the precinct within hours. Some held signs. Others simply stood in silence, holding up phones playing the video on loop. The footage had become a symbol, not just of this one moment, but of the countless others that didn't have a Devon, didn't have a camera, didn't have a title like director to shift the balance. For Marcus Hale, however, the real chaos wasn't in the streets. It was at home. The sun had barely risen when the first reporter rang the bell. By midday, a full row of cameras stood parked outside the Hale residence. Neighbors peered from behind their blinds. Drones buzzed faintly overhead. Journalists from networks Marcus had once briefed during quiet, off-the-record investigations now shouted questions at his gate, demanding quotes, reactions, televised apologies, televised statements. Inside the house, Marcus stood by the window, still in his undershirt and slacks, sipping black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. His expression hadn't changed. It was the same still mask he'd worn on the street, only now there were no cameras he controlled. "You can't ignore this," Maya said gently, standing beside him. "They're not going to let this go." He said nothing. His eyes tracked a young reporter as she paced near the fence, lips moving quickly into a microphone. "You didn't do anything wrong, Marcus. That's not what they're asking. They're asking for the truth." "No," he said, setting the cup down. "They're asking for an angle." Maya walked to the table and picked up the department-issued phone Marcus had tossed there earlier. Notifications flashed across the screen. Missed calls, emails, statements pending approval. She turned it face down and looked at him with the same piercing clarity that had always kept him honest. "You don't get to be silent this time," she said. "You've seen too many people silenced, too many cases closed, too many lives twisted by this exact kind of thing. You've always operated in the background, pulling the strings, documenting the abuse, filing the reports. But now, you're not watching it happen to someone else. It happened to you, and they're waiting to see what you do about it." Marcus rubbed the bridge of his nose, sighing through the weight of it. "I'm not a symbol." "No," Maya said. "But you could be the one that forces the system to look at itself." He nodded once, slowly, without commitment. That afternoon, the silence broke, not from Marcus, but from inside the department. Without warning, an internal memo was circulated from the commissioner's office. Paul Destry's personal header at the top, signature at the bottom. It was brief, but chillingly clear. Effective immediately, any ongoing investigations overseen by Director Marcus Hale shall be reassigned to independent review pending administrative clarification. Marcus received no warning, no phone call, no explanation. They were stripping him of his own investigations. Every case he had worked, every report nearing its conclusion, every complaint he'd prepared to act on, every officer he'd watched for months, was suddenly pulled from his hands and redirected elsewhere. Cases were paused, files locked, access revoked. The message wasn't subtle. It wasn't just about optics. It was retaliation. The commissioner's office released a second statement shortly after, citing a need for neutrality during the investigation involving one of our senior officers. They claimed the reassignment was for Marcus's protection and integrity. But the truth was unmistakable. Destry was circling the wagons, distancing the department from the man who had become the face of its worst nightmare. That evening, as the sky burned orange and the camera crews packed up just long enough to catch a late meal, Marcus sat in his study alone, blinds drawn, the room lit only by a desk lamp. Case files still lined the shelves, but now they felt like ghosts. Locked drawers, empty folders. Maya entered quietly and set a fresh cup of coffee beside him. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know what this job means to you." Marcus didn't answer for a long time. He stared at the framed citation on his wall, the one that praised him for exceptional service in rooting out internal corruption. Eventually, he said, "They're trying to make me regret defending myself. They can't rewrite what happened." "No," he said. "But they can erase what comes next, if I let them." Maya sat across from him. "So what are you going to do?" He leaned forward, his hands clasped, not with fear, but with purpose. His voice was soft, but it carried weight. "I'm going to make sure they don't get the last word." The city never really slept, but in some places it held its breath. At night, the Department of Records and Internal Oversight sat in near silence. A cavernous space of old tile, steel cabinets, and flickering fluorescent bulbs left on just long enough to keep the servers from going dark. The few glowing monitors scattered across the empty workstations pulsed like quiet beacons in the shadows, syncing their files with distant databases, updating logs that no one would read until morning. The place felt forgotten, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and disuse, and that made it perfect. It wasn't listed on any patrol routes. No external lights flicked on with motion. The front desk had been cleared out months ago after funding cuts, and the security firm that once monitored the entryway had since been reassigned to higher-risk sites. There were no guards, no wandering eyes, just walls, wires, and silence. Marcus had chosen this building for that exact reason. It was one of the few spaces left in the city where silence could still be trusted. He parked his vehicle far from the main entrance, hidden under the shadow of a crumbling overhang where no camera lens could see. His coat collar turned up against the wind. He moved across the gravel loading bay and entered through an old maintenance door that still responded to his credentials, though he doubted it would for much longer. With the commissioner's office tightening access protocols and pulling authority from his badge by the hour, he knew the window was closing. Every second counted now. Inside, the corridors were cold and unlit, the buzz of outdated ventilation systems echoing faintly overhead. He walked with purpose, his footsteps deliberate but quiet, weaving through file stacks and storage closets until he reached the dimly lit back room near the old server core. The door was cracked open just slightly. A single desk lamp glowed in the corner. She was already here. Sergeant Lena Ortega sat at the far end of the room, her posture tense but composed. She didn't greet him with a smile or a nod. She simply met his eyes and gestured toward the seat across from her. An invitation, not a command. In front of her, the soft glow of her laptop screen lit her face in faint pulses. The light drew out the lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes, the furrow that had settled across her brow. She didn't look scared. She looked like someone who had waited too long to say what needed saying. Marcus closed the door behind him and pulled out the chair opposite hers, sitting down without a word. The old desk creaked beneath the weight of the silence between them. The hum of distant cooling fans and flickering halogen lights filled the background like a soft drone of waiting tension. "You shouldn't have come here," Marcus said finally, his voice even but not cold. "Neither should you," Ortega replied, just as evenly. "But here we are." There was no judgment in her voice, only resolve. The same resolve he'd seen in her during long nights reviewing use-of-force statements when she'd stayed behind to ask one more question, to open one more report, long after the others had stopped caring. Without another word, Ortega rotated the laptop toward him. The screen now angled in his direction. Marcus leaned forward, and his eyes settled on the document displayed. A simple spreadsheet at first glance, but its implications were immediate and unmistakable. There were names, dates, badge numbers, case IDs. Each entry was linked to an internal note or action, or more often, the absence of one. At the top, in plain black text, was the heading, Priority Monitoring, Internal Discretion Only. The list was long enough to make him uncomfortable, but short enough to make its intent clear. 23 names. He read through them slowly, absorbing each one with a heavy familiarity. Some were names he'd flagged himself over the years, officers whose patterns of behavior straddled the line between suspicion and provable misconduct. Others were newer, names that hadn't yet reached his desk, but that carried with them the same stench of unchecked power. But then, midway down the list, his eyes found the one he expected, the one that made all the noise in his head fall away. Cole Renner. His jaw tensed. "You kept your own copy," he said after a long beat. Though he wasn't accusing her. "I pulled it the night after the stop," Ortega said, keeping her voice low. "Before they scrubbed my access. Once the commissioner reassigned your cases, the access protocols changed across all internal systems. I lost visibility into most of the open files. But this was still cached on the desktop. You know what they'll say if they find out," Marcus said, though he didn't bother to finish the thought. "They already suspended me," Ortega replied, her voice firmer now. "I've already been marked. So there's no point pretending I still have something to lose." He let that sit between them for a moment, nodding once, almost to himself. "The list was never meant to circulate," Marcus said. "It was part of a sealed briefing series. Names under early watch. Enough suspicion to investigate, not enough evidence to act on. Quiet reviews only." "And Renner made the cut," Ortega said, not asking. "That stop wasn't a coincidence." "No," Marcus replied. "It wasn't." Ortega leaned forward now, bracing her elbows on the desk, her fingers interlaced. "What do you think he was doing?" "Testing you. Targeting you?" "I don't think it was personal," Marcus answered, his tone thoughtful. "Not at first. I think someone gave him an assignment, knowing he didn't ask questions. I think they chose him because he was volatile, and because volatile men can be steered with the right pressure. And once he recognized you, that's when it became personal," Marcus said, "and reckless." Ortega sat back in her chair and reached for the flash drive beside the keyboard. She slid it across the table. "I saved more than the list. Every time a report was flagged and later dismissed, I saved the audit logs. You'll find timestamps, overrides. Every instance when someone in admin wiped a complaint or redirected a review. Renner wasn't just lucky. He was protected." Marcus reached inside his coat and pulled out a matching drive. "And this," he said, laying it beside hers, "is everything I built before they froze my access. Patterns, suppressed statements, unresolved civilian claims, and names. Not just beat cops. People upstairs." For a moment, they just sat there, both drives between them like weapons on a table neither of them wanted to use. "I think we both know," Ortega said quietly, "that this doesn't end with Renner." Marcus nodded, eyes fixed on the list still glowing on the screen. It never did. By the end of the week, the city was no longer watching. It was marching. The footage of the traffic stop on East 49th had evolved beyond an isolated moment of abuse into a movement that rattled the very ground it was filmed on. What began as a bystander's steady hands and an instinct to record had swelled into a collective reckoning, spilling out across neighborhoods, bleeding through barriers of class and district lines, and converging into one clear, thunderous demand: accountability without delay and justice without compromise. Screens everywhere, from phones to storefront televisions to massive LED billboards, flashed stills of Marcus Hale, with his hands raised in quiet restraint, and of Officer Cole Renner in full uniform, weapon drawn, caught mid-escalation. The video had circulated so widely, so rapidly, that even news stations that typically sidestepped controversy had no choice but to feature it. Talk shows, live streams, and primetime broadcasts all made room for it in their rotations, each one dissecting every frame of the footage with the obsessive care of a surgeon studying a rare pathology. The world had not just witnessed it, they were absorbing it, framing it, interpreting it through every lens of race, authority, protocol, and morality they could reach for. Yet amid the rush of voices rising in solidarity and outrage, there were others, voices cloaked in professional neutrality, who tried to pull the conversation away from what was plainly visible. Panels filled with law enforcement experts and sanitized legal commentators began to offer their polished assessments, not of Renner's decision to escalate, but of Marcus's measured response. Some questioned whether a man in Marcus's position, no matter the threat, should have physically engaged with an officer. Others suggested that his failure to immediately announce his title and credentials had, in some way, contributed to the misunderstanding, as though the barrel of a gun required a more courteous introduction. With every new voice added to the noise, Marcus watched as the truth of what happened to him began to fracture, not because it was unclear, but because too many people had too much to lose if it remained unbroken. Then came the department's official position. 3 days after the confrontation, the Office of Media and Communications issued a 2-sentence statement to every press outlet in the city, and within minutes, it was everywhere. The carefully worded release read, "Due to technical interference at the time of the traffic stop involving Officer Cole Renner and Director Marcus Hale, the body camera footage experienced partial corruption. We are working diligently to recover the missing data." The implication was as sharp as it was cowardly. The footage, they claimed, was compromised. The only full record of the encounter now rested in the hands of a civilian. And while Devon's video was damning, it was not theirs. It had not passed through their filters. It had not been redacted or reframed, which made it dangerous. Inside Marcus's home, the air had grown heavier with each passing day, as though the walls themselves had begun absorbing the weight of public scrutiny and institutional retreat. The front gate, once quiet, now held a near-constant line of reporters, civil rights attorneys, documentary filmmakers, and curious passers-by who treated the house like a landmark. Phone calls came in by the minute, some offering support, others making veiled threats disguised as advice. And through it all, Marcus had remained still, choosing not to speak, not because he was unsure of what to say, but because he was calculating exactly when it would matter most. But Maya could wait no longer. She stood at the steps of City Hall on a humid afternoon, dressed in slate-gray slacks and a navy blouse, her hair pulled back tightly, her presence unmistakable. With no podium, no entourage, and no official press release, she addressed the crowd directly. Her voice carried not by microphone, but by purpose. "My husband was calm," she said to the hundreds gathered below. "He was respectful. He followed every instruction given to him, even as those instructions shifted from protocol to intimidation. He made no sudden movements. He made no threats. He did what every black man is told to do when stopped by an officer. He survived." The crowd stood in silence, many nodding, some recording, all listening. "But survival," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "should not be considered a triumph. It should be the minimum. And when an officer raises a weapon to a civilian who poses no threat, when a department chooses to explain away that decision instead of condemning it, when the only full footage mysteriously disappears, and when the man who exposed all of it is asked to stay silent for the sake of appearances, that is not justice. That is preservation of power. And we will not preserve a system that sacrifices the truth." The footage of Maya's speech traveled almost as fast as the original video. Within hours, She had become the voice of the moment, clear, composed, and utterly unwilling to let the city forget what had happened. While Marcus remained behind the scenes, piecing together patterns and planning his next move, Maya carried the fire forward. And then, quietly, the summons came. It wasn't formal. There was no official letterhead or electronic trail, just a short message sent through an intermediary, delivered by a department liaison too nervous to hold eye contact. Marcus was to meet Commissioner Paul Destry at a neutral location, off the record, off the books, and off the radar of public attention. The meeting took place in a discreet government conference suite, tucked inside a state-owned facility overlooking the East Docks. The room was cold and angular, its gray walls and unmarked doors designed to blend into their surroundings. Marcus arrived alone, and Destry was already inside, standing by the far window with his back turned, watching the cranes move containers across the harbor as if contemplating the weight of it all. "You've become quite the story," Destry said without turning. His voice was dry, calculated, and too calm. "I didn't ask to be," Marcus replied as he remained standing. Destry turned slowly, gesturing toward a chair across the glass table between them, but Marcus stayed where he was. The commissioner studied him for a moment, then gave a slight nod and sat down himself. "We're in a difficult position," Destry began, folding his hands in front of him like a man delivering a sermon. "There are protests, calls for resignations, media hysteria. Emotions are high. The public sees a villain and a victim. But institutions don't work in absolutes. They require subtlety, containment, compromise. If you're asking me to help contain this," Marcus said, his voice low but unflinching, "you're asking the wrong man. I'm asking you to think bigger than just this incident," Destry replied. "If this becomes a crusade, the fallout will go beyond Cole Renner. You know what's in those files. You know what happens if they surface. This city doesn't survive a scandal that large." Marcus said nothing at first. He watched the commissioner carefully, the way his fingers tapped gently against the desk, the way his eyes never quite met his own. There was no concern in Destry's expression, only calculation. "They were never just protecting Renner," Marcus said quietly. "They were protecting themselves." Destry didn't deny it. The system didn't respond with an apology. It responded with a warning. Within 72 hours of Marcus leaving that closed-door meeting with Commissioner Destry, the first breach occurred. It wasn't a physical break-in, not something so crude or obvious. It came in the form of an internal flag on the Department of Justice's audit system. At first, it looked like routine background traffic, a security review triggered by outdated clearance markers on a server cluster at Internal Affairs. But when Marcus cross-checked the ping against his own case folders, what he found was far more precise. His sealed files, encrypted, compartmentalized, and marked for future review, were gone. Not corrupted, not archived, gone. Entire investigations he had spent months assembling, complaints against veteran officers, internal memos showing deliberate suppression of misconduct, names that had come up in whistleblower interviews, all erased without a trace. Even his backup cloud vaults had been accessed, just long enough to disrupt the integrity of the timestamps, rendering any future disclosure subject to legal doubt. There was no digital footprint, no error report. Whoever had taken it knew exactly what they were doing. Marcus sat at his home office desk staring at the empty drive log, his hands folded in front of him. He didn't react outwardly, but something inside him settled. Not with defeat, but with clarity. They weren't afraid of exposure. They were afraid of survival. Because if Marcus Hale survived this intact, with proof, with documentation, with the public behind him, then the house they had built would fall, brick by carefully stacked brick. And so they moved to discredit, not with loud accusations, but with shadows. That same day, Maya received her first direct message. It didn't contain slurs or death threats. Those had been coming in steadily since her speech. But this one was different. It was precise. The sender's handle was anonymous, but the photo attached showed Maya outside her office 2 days earlier, holding a case file beneath her arm, the streetlight behind her casting a narrow silhouette across the pavement. The message below it read, "Careful where you walk." Sometimes people forget to look both ways. She didn't show Marcus the message until late that night, once their son was asleep and the curtains were drawn tight. "They're watching us," she said quietly, placing the phone on the table. "Not just online. They're following." Marcus studied the image for a long time. The angle, the distance, the precision. It wasn't meant to scare her. It was meant to warn him. He'd pushed too far, and they wanted him to feel the cost. That same evening, protesters began gathering outside their home. Not all supporters. While many stood in solidarity, some carried signs accusing Marcus of setting up the encounter for fame. Others questioned the legitimacy of his rank, spreading half-truths and misquotes lifted from fringe broadcasts. The crowd swelled beyond the sidewalk, spilling into the street. The police didn't intervene. The city claimed the right to peaceful assembly. But Marcus recognized the tactic. Flood the gate with noise, blur the line between protest and pressure, and create the illusion of doubt. And then there was Devon. The footage he had recorded, the same video that ignited the fire, had made him a hero in some circles and a target in others. He had turned down every interview and donation offer, choosing instead to focus on his job at a small tech repair shop on the south end of the city. But 2 nights after Maya's message, Devon's phone glitched during a call. When he checked it, half his camera roll was missing. His home Wi-Fi router had been remotely accessed. His location settings had been toggled on without his input. When he went to log into his cloud account, it was locked for unusual activity. He called Marcus in a panic. "I didn't do anything wrong," Devon said, his voice shaking. "I just filmed what I saw. That's not illegal, is it?" "No," Marcus said gently. "But the truth has a price. You've just started to feel it." Despite the darkness tightening around them, a flicker of light remained inside the department. Sergeant Lena Ortega, suspended but not silenced, had begun leaking documents from the precinct. Quietly, carefully, redacted officer logs, internal emails about the footage, memos discussing narrative management. She sent them one by one through encrypted proxies to an anonymous journalist who had covered departmental corruption cases in the past. She included timelines, cross-referenced edits, and proof that Renner's body cam footage had not been corrupted, but manually flagged for deletion by an IT supervisor under direct orders from the commissioner's office. Marcus received copies of the leaks before they went public. He read through them at the kitchen table. Maya seated across from him, her hand resting atop his as he scrolled. Line after line, they watched the truth unspool. Not just about Renner, but about a pattern, a structure, a network of protection designed not for justice, but for insulation. It was then that Marcus made his decision. He would speak, publicly, formally, and not to the press. He reached out to the State Oversight Committee, an independent body with jurisdiction over law enforcement ethics violations and procedural accountability, and requested to testify before a special session. The response was swift and unanimous. They accepted. The announcement went live the next day. DOJ Director Marcus Hale to testify before State Oversight Committee regarding internal misconduct. The public reaction split like glass under pressure. One half hailed him a whistleblower of rare courage, an honest man refusing to bend, even as the system tried to crush him. Hashtags with his name resurfaced, and activists praised his decision to speak on record. Crowds gathered again, this time outside the Capitol, holding signs that read, "We believe Marcus," and "Transparency now." But the other half, driven by department loyalists, political mouthpieces, and thinly veiled hit pieces, pushed a different narrative. They called him a manipulator, an opportunist, A man playing victim to advance a personal crusade. His service record was scrutinized, twisted out of context. Old audio clips from past interviews were spliced into montages, made to sound arrogant, conspiratorial, radical. Marcus read the headlines, watched the segments, and sat in silence. He had spent a career building cases in the dark. Now the lights were on, and everyone was watching. In the days leading up to the testimony, the house was quieter than usual. Not because the world outside had calmed. If anything, it had only grown louder. But because the noise had reached a point where words no longer felt useful. Interviews aired every hour. Opinion pieces filled the Sunday pages. Every search of Marcus's name returned 1,000 interpretations of a man he no longer recognized. He sat most nights in his study, not drafting statements or building timelines, but simply thinking, not about what was said, but about what hadn't been, about what he had left unsaid for years. There had been a time, 7 years back, when Cole Renner's name first came across his desk, not as a suspect, not even as a threat, but as part of a promotion recommendation list. His supervisor had written him up for decisive field leadership and incident resolution under pressure, the kind of polished language that masked a pattern of aggression in clean terminology. Marcus remembered reading it, frowning slightly at the odd phrasing, and setting it aside. There had been a footnote, a formal warning 2 years prior for a traffic stop that had turned physical without cause. No formal complaint was filed, no charges, no attention, and so Marcus, buried under a dozen urgent investigations with real momentum, chose to flag it for review and move on. He hadn't denied the promotion. He hadn't signed it either. He'd let it pass by, unsigned but unopposed. And months later, when Renner's badge was pinned with ceremonial applause, Marcus had watched the photos circulate internally and told himself it wasn't his place to intervene. He told himself there wasn't enough, that he didn't have time, that the department wouldn't have backed his objection. Now, with everything unraveling in front of him, Marcus couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if he had spoken up back then, when the storm was still a cloud on the horizon, not lightning in his chest. Late that night, as he stood in the doorway of the kitchen, arms folded, eyes heavy with exhaustion, Maya found him there, silent, unmoving, almost distant in his own home. She didn't speak at first. She just watched him, watched the way his shoulders rose and fell, like someone carrying more than weight. "You've been somewhere else all day," she finally said. "Wherever you are, you need to come back." "I've been thinking," Marcus replied, not turning around, "about all the times I should have done more. The times I let it slide because there wasn't enough, or because it wasn't the right moment, or because I told myself someone else would step up, but they didn't. And now, it's here, all of it, on us." Maya stepped closer, her voice softer now, but firm. "And you think carrying all that guilt is going to help you get through this?" "I think it's the only thing keeping me honest," he said, finally looking at her. "I keep asking myself, if I hadn't been the one with the title, with the badge, with the suit, would I have made it home that night?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand on his chest, her fingers resting gently over his heartbeat. "I've watched you give your life to this job," she said, "to this mission, but what you're about to do isn't just professional. It's personal, and it's dangerous. Once you speak in that chamber, you can't go back to being the quiet man in the background." "I know. They're going to come for you," she said. "They're going to twist your words, dig into our lives, threaten everything we've built. So I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Not like an officer, not like a witness, just as the man I married." He nodded slowly, holding her gaze. "Are you willing," she asked, her voice now steady, "to give up your entire reputation, everything you've worked for, to fix this?" He didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know the truth, but because saying it out loud would make it real. "I'm afraid," he admitted finally, "not of losing the job or the pension, but of what happens if I succeed, of what it will cost us." Maya's hand didn't move. "Then be afraid, but do it anyway." The next day, Devon called. Marcus could tell the moment he answered that something had shifted. Devon's voice was different. Not angry, not panicked, just quiet, too quiet. "They called my mom's house," he said. "Asked if I still lived there. Then they sent a package. No return label. Just a flash drive and a message. Said I should watch it before I go giving any more statements." "What was on it?" Marcus asked. His tone sharpened. "I didn't open it," Devon said. "I didn't want to know. I've already been getting messages all week. People asking why I even filmed. Calling me a traitor. Saying I set the whole thing up. Like I'm just trying to get famous off someone else's story." "You did the right thing," Marcus said. "You showed the truth." "I didn't think the truth would come with this kind of weight," Devon murmured. I thought it would help. But now I don't know. I haven't slept. I haven't gone to work. I'm scared to leave the house." Marcus didn't speak right away. Then, after a long pause, he said, "I need you to hold on a little longer. I know this isn't what you asked for, but what you did mattered. You gave them a reason to listen. And now, I have to give them the words to understand." Devon didn't reply, but he didn't hang up either. And that, Marcus took as enough. That evening, as he sat alone in the living room with the blinds drawn and the hallway light casting faint shadows across the wall, Marcus stared at his prepared statement. 12 pages of careful facts, unshakable proof, and measured conclusions. Then he pushed it aside, because when he spoke, it wouldn't be the paper that mattered. It would be the truth. The leak dropped just after sunrise, not as part of any official statement or orchestrated campaign, but as a quiet rupture in the city's carefully managed narrative, slipping past digital firewalls and comms teams with the precision of a scalpel to the heart. There had been no warning, no press advisory sent to inboxes the night before, no vague headline teaser meant to prepare the public for what was coming. Instead, the information arrived raw, direct, and unfiltered. An anonymous upload to a public justice reform database, nestled among thousands of forgotten cases and policy white papers, but glowing like a live wire once opened. Inside the upload was a full case record, time-stamped documents, internal memos, officer statements, redacted but still revealing, and a single chilling conclusion that no longer fit within the narrative the department had tried to maintain. Cole Renner, the same officer who had held Marcus at gunpoint on East 49th, had been involved in the death of a civilian during a detainment the previous year. The name in the report was Caleb Drayton, a 29-year-old graphic designer who had no criminal record, no outstanding warrants, and no history of violence. According to the report, he had been stopped by Renner just after midnight on a dead-end service road behind the old rail yard. The official entry listed the stop as routine. What followed in the documentation was a vague sequence of events stitched together with bureaucratic phrasing and thin details. At some point, during the detainment, Caleb had become non-compliant and then unresponsive. By the time paramedics were called, almost 20 minutes after the initial contact, Caleb was dead. The body showed bruises around the neck and discoloration along the ribs, but the cause of death was filed as sudden cardiac failure, and no toxicology report was ever submitted with the rest of the documentation. The body cam footage from that night, as listed in the log, was marked initiated, but there was no file linked to the entry. Within 72 hours, the case was closed. There had been no press conference, no public statement, no disciplinary review, just a quiet signature and a closed file, buried beneath layers of red tape, never intended to see light. Until now. Within hours, the leak was picked up by every major outlet across the state. What began as a few screenshots shared by legal watchdogs exploded into national attention as journalists, civil rights advocates, and local politicians began threading together the implications. The questions came fast and without pause. Why was this file sealed? Why was no external investigation launched? Who authorized the rapid closure? And how many more names had been buried the same way? The state attorney general, likely seeing the public pressure rising by the minute, issued an emergency order to formally reopen the case. The language in the release was cautious, an official commitment to re-examine new materials relevant to a previously adjudicated use of force incident involving Officer Renner. But the intention was unmistakable. The system had been caught failing, and now it was scrambling to appear engaged. As if the timing had been orchestrated by fate itself, an audio interview surfaced the following day featuring a woman whose voice trembled at first, but strengthened with every word. Her identity was shielded, her appearance blurred for safety. But her story cut through the noise like a blade through glass. She had been a probationary patrol officer, partnered with Renner during her early days in the field. In the 10-minute recording, she detailed specific encounters where Renner would stop black men without cause, citing vague suspicions or imaginary tips, always with the same offhand justification: just keeping the streets clean. She recalled him laughing after a stop where he cuffed a 17-year-old without charges, muttering that nobody misses a ghost. She said he would repeat the phrase like a ritual. "You pull over anyone who looks out of place." She had never reported it. "I thought it wouldn't matter," she admitted in the recording. "I thought if I said something, I'd be reassigned, or worse, labeled a problem, someone not willing to fall in line. And after seeing what happened to Director Hale, I couldn't keep that quiet anymore." Her statement, along with the reopened Drayton case, sent a tremor through City Hall and widened the fracture already forming within the department's foundation. Back inside the precinct, pressure mounted. And it didn't take long for that pressure to find Ortega. She had been careful. Every file she leaked passed through multiple layers of encryption, routed through old equipment never assigned to her badge ID. She used external drives, erased logs, moved during shift changes, but eventually, someone noticed. Maybe it was a line of code, a mirrored timestamp, or just a pattern flagged by an automated internal review. Whatever the trigger, it led to a closed-door meeting with a captain she didn't trust, and two investigators who didn't need to raise their voices. They didn't accuse. They didn't ask. They simply handed her a notice of suspension and told her to collect her things. She texted Marcus a single line that evening: "They cut me loose." That was all it said. No explanation, no defense. Just the quiet, surgical removal of the last voice he had within the walls of the department. One by one, they were silenced. Not through violence, but through administrative anesthesia. Now, standing on the edge of a public testimony that could shatter the department's credibility, Marcus realized the floor beneath him was no longer a floor. It was a rope, and it was burning. And then, Destry came. Not as a bureaucrat with press handlers or legal counsel, but as a man who still believed a well-placed conversation could keep the storm at bay. He arrived on foot, alone, wearing plain clothes and a guarded expression, as if he'd come to offer help, but couldn't bring himself to call it what it was: a final plea. Maya opened the door, but didn't let him pass the threshold. Marcus stepped out onto the porch, shutting the door behind him. The street was quiet. The air smelled like rust and ozone, the lingering promise of summer rain. Destry didn't mince words. "This case is beyond us now," he said. "It's no longer about right or wrong. It's about survival. Yours, mine, and the city's." Marcus didn't reply. Destry shifted his weight and looked down the street. "You step into that hearing, and we all fall. You know it. I know it. You still have an option. Early retirement, full pension, public commendation. We'll call it a transition, a necessary pause. You walk away intact. Your family walks away untouched. But if you go through with this..." He didn't finish the sentence. Marcus didn't need him to. And after a long pause, with the city and all its ghosts breathing down their necks, He looked Destry in the eye and said only this: "You had the chance to fix this before it reached me. Now I'm the last one left willing to say it out loud." And then he turned away, stepping back into the house. Behind him, the rain began to fall. The rain fell softly that night, not in torrents, but in slow, deliberate drops that tapped against the window panes like a quiet rhythm of inevitability. Inside the house, the atmosphere was still, not peaceful. Never peaceful these days, but charged with a kind of waiting silence that stretched from room to room, thick enough to make every breath feel heavier than the last. Marcus stood in his study with the lights off, the muted glow of a desk lamp tracing the edges of the files scattered before him. He hadn't moved much since Destry had walked away from the porch hours earlier. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to salvage. The offer had been clear: silence in exchange for survival. But survival wasn't the same as living, not if it meant accepting a world that protected the guilty and punished the honest. Marcus had seen too many men like Destry, men who had once spoken of reform with conviction, only to carve out space for themselves in the rot, convincing everyone, including themselves, that their compromise was a kind of wisdom. Marcus wasn't interested in wisdom anymore. Down the hall, Maya sat at the kitchen table, typing with the kind of focus she reserved for moments that mattered. She had said nothing when Marcus returned inside, only nodded once and disappeared behind her laptop. When he finally joined her, she turned the screen toward him without ceremony. On it was a letter, unpolished, unfiltered, and meant for no one's approval. She had titled it simply, "To Whom the System Has Failed." It opened with a truth the department had worked hard to bury: that ever since Marcus chose not to remain silent, their family had been targeted, not with overt violence, but with shadowed intimidation. Maya described the messages sent to her private accounts, the image of herself caught leaving work and posted by an anonymous profile, the sudden cancellation of her speaking engagements, and the emails to her employer, warning that she was politicizing a personal matter. She recounted the nights they stayed up refreshing motion sensors on the front porch, the calls from numbers that didn't speak, and the looks their son began receiving at school. Curious at first, then colder. But it wasn't just a recounting of suffering. It was a challenge, a mirror held up to the public and the institutions they trusted, asking plainly, what does it mean when the only man brave enough to tell the truth has to risk everything to do it? The letter concluded with one simple, damning sentence: if they can do this to a man tasked with watching them, what can they do to the rest of us? Maya emailed it to 3 editors she had met over the years, all of whom responded within the hour. By dawn, the letter was on the front page of 6 major outlets. By noon, it had been read aloud on television. By sunset, it was being shared across thousands of screens, underlined by readers who had never met her, but now spoke her words like they had waited their whole lives to hear them. The response was immediate and unignorable. Calls flooded in from advocacy organizations, legal aid groups, and even a handful of local officials now scrambling to distance themselves from Destry's office. But through it all, Marcus stayed quiet, waiting for something he couldn't name, but would know when it arrived. It came 2 nights later, in the form of a small, unmarked envelope left on his doorstep. No note, no courier. Just a black USB drive, thin and ordinary, but still warm from someone's palm. He waited until the house was asleep to plug it in. Inside the folder were his files, the missing ones, the sealed investigation documents he had spent months building, his original work, encrypted, compiled, then erased by the very servers he had trusted to protect them. Every report was intact, every line of evidence restored, but there was more. Someone had added a final document, a compiled list titled Internal Preservation Candidates, 5-Year Pattern. It was a detailed breakdown of 12 officers across various precincts, each flagged for consistent abuse of power, excessive force, or internal obstruction, officers who had each been involved in incidents with vulnerable civilians, and who had walked away without consequence. The records showed how every case had been intercepted, rerouted, or dismissed entirely. At the bottom of each summary was a signature field, Paul Destry. In some cases, it was his digital sign-off. In others, a hard-scanned approval slip from a printed memo. The correlation was undeniable. The commissioner hadn't just known about the corruption, he had protected it, facilitated it, and elevated it. Marcus sat back in his chair and let the weight of the truth settle across his shoulders. The walls around him felt closer than they had before, not in a suffocating way, but in the way a stage feels just before the curtain rises. There was no mistaking it now. He wasn't walking into the hearing to share concerns or highlight discrepancies. He was walking in to drop a match. The next morning, Marcus stepped into the living room, where Maya stood staring at the muted television. Footage of another protest scrolled across the screen. This time the crowd chanted both his name and Caleb Drayton's. The storm outside had shifted. "I have to release it," he said quietly. Maya didn't ask what it meant. She didn't need to. She just turned and met his eyes, and after a long moment, she nodded. "Then release it," she said, "and don't hold back." By midday, Marcus contacted a trusted media liaison with encrypted access to the files. He made it clear. No summaries, no redactions, no editorial filters. Every name, every action, every memo, released in full. Within hours, a website went live under the heading, "What They Tried to Bury." The documents flooded the public. Social media feeds lit up with screenshots of redacted email trails, Destry's signatures, complaint patterns, and falsified clearance overrides. Hashtags trended. Journalists lined up with questions. Some praised Marcus as the only honest man in a dishonest world. Others accused him of treason, of endangering public trust, of destroying the thin blue line that held society together. But Marcus didn't respond to the noise. He simply prepared for what came next. It was late morning when the podium was set. The steps of the state capitol had held 1,000 speeches before, most of them staged with flags, handshakes, and neatly folded rhetoric. But this time, there were no smiling faces behind the seal. No silent entourage standing in rows. No attempt to soften the edges of what had come. Just one microphone, one man, and the truth rising behind him like a storm refusing to pass. The air held that charged stillness before something breaks. The wind brushing against the shoulders of journalists, elbowing for position, their lenses tilted upward, their fingers hovering just above record buttons. Protesters lined the square beyond the barriers. Some held signs, others held silence, but every single one of them was waiting. Then Marcus Hale stepped to the podium. He wore a simple gray suit, no flag pin, no affiliation patch, just a crisp white shirt, and the calm of a man who had already lived through fire and was prepared to walk through the ash. He didn't look around, didn't nod to the crowd or the officials lurking behind the curtains inside. He opened a single folder, set it down on the podium, and raised his eyes to the cameras. His voice, when it came, wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It carried on the weight of restraint finally lifted. "I never intended to be here," he said, the words spoken without anger, but with a clarity that quieted the murmurs in the square. "My job was to hold the line from inside, to protect the public by investigating misconduct before it became crisis. And for years, I did that work, quietly, carefully, within the walls they gave me. But what I've come to understand is that silence can become complicity, and complicity is what they count on." He paused just long enough to let the words settle. "On August 12th, I was pulled over without cause. I was threatened at gunpoint. I was accused, silenced, and nearly killed. And the man who did it was an officer I had once flagged for early review, an officer who should have never worn a badge, but he did. Because the system chose to protect him." He lifted the first document from the folder, holding it up for the cameras. The screen behind him projected the file as it appeared. Unredacted, time-stamped, with signatures intact. This is one of 12 internal memos authorizing suppression of misconduct investigations involving city officers, all signed by Commissioner Paul Destry, all routed through an administrative override system designed not to investigate, but to erase. A murmur ran through the press corps, flashes going off as the image was captured from every angle. Marcus continued without flinching. Each of these officers was accused of misconduct, ranging from illegal detainment to excessive force. Not one of them faced disciplinary action. Not one of them lost their badge. Instead, they were promoted, decorated, protected. And I have the documentation to prove it. He placed the sheet back down and unfolded another. This is a report on the death of Caleb Drayton, an unarmed civilian who died in custody during a traffic stop conducted by Officer Renner. No body cam footage, no external review. The case was closed in under 72 hours. This man, Marcus said, tapping the page, deserved more than a footnote. He turned the page again. This is the signed clearance of that case's closure. Again, by Commissioner Destry. The silence broke. Gasps echoed from the crowd. Reporters began shouting over each other. Inside the Capitol, phones rang, and aides scattered like birds flushed from hiding. Marcus raised a hand, and the crowd quieted. "I'm not here to damage the system," he said, voice lower now, almost a whisper, amplified by steel. "I'm here to force it, to admit what it became." If the public is expected to trust law enforcement, then law enforcement must be accountable to the public, not protected from it. He closed the folder gently. "And if I lose every friend, every pension, every safe harbor, because I said this out loud, then so be it." The press conference ended not with applause, but with the unrelenting hum of thousands of cameras transmitting the truth in real time. There was no room for spin, no filter strong enough to dull what had just been said. It was done. By the next morning, the fallout began. Commissioner Paul Destry submitted his resignation in a single-paragraph memo to the mayor's office. The language was cold and unrevealing, to preserve the integrity of the institution, but it carried no legal shield. His name was already on the documents. His interviews had already been requested, and his political allies were scattering like rats from a breached hull. Within 24 hours, the district attorney's office announced formal charges against Cole Renner, including assault with a deadly weapon, attempted manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and falsification of law enforcement records. The footage, the whistleblower testimony, and the newly surfaced body cam deletion order created a chain of evidence too strong to ignore. Renner was taken into custody quietly. There were no sirens, no press, just a door opening and closing, the sound of justice beginning, not as revenge, but as overdue correction. In an unexpected reversal, Sergeant Lena Ortega's suspension was not only lifted, but the Internal Affairs Board issued a formal commendation for her whistleblower protection efforts, an acknowledgement that her quiet rebellion had exposed the cracks within. And then came the governor. In a somber televised statement broadcast that evening from the state capitol's rotunda, she addressed the people directly. "There is no courage in silence," she said. "There is only delay, and what Director Hale has exposed cannot be undone, but it can be faced. Today, I am ordering an immediate external review of all city policing systems, including oversight structures, complaint handling procedures, and disciplinary outcomes. This is not a gesture. This is the start of a complete restructuring." The cameras lingered for a moment on the governor's face, just long enough to capture the sincerity in her expression. Marcus watched from his living room, Maya beside him, her hand resting lightly over his. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The echo of the last week was still unfolding. But one thing was certain. The silence had finally been broken. The courtroom wasn't large, but it felt cavernous in its silence. the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from gravity. Every sound inside echoed with purpose. Every shift in the gallery, every shuffled piece of paper, every breath drawn by a juror had weight behind it, as though the walls themselves were listening, judging, remembering. When Marcus Hale took the witness stand, the room seemed to tighten in around him, not out of hostility, but out of anticipation. There was no ceremony in his entrance, no special introduction. He walked with steady steps, one hand brushing along the edge of the gallery railing, the other loosely at his side. He did not glance at Renner. He didn't need to. He placed his hand on the Bible, took the oath, and when he sat, he did not shift in his seat. His spine stayed straight. His eyes didn't flicker. It was the posture of a man who had carried too much truth for too long and had finally arrived at the only place where it could be released. The prosecutor's voice was quiet as she began, asking for the details of the stop. Marcus answered plainly, without embellishment. "I was driving home from a late meeting," he said, his tone measured. "It was dusk, and I noticed the cruiser behind me 2 blocks before the lights came on. I pulled over immediately." He recounted each moment with clinical accuracy, not robotic, but precise. The request for his license, the officer's tone, the moment his name was given and dismissed. The second Renner's hand hovered over his holster. The shift in air when the weapon came into view. "I told him who I was," Marcus said. "Not to escape consequence, but to establish clarity. I said, 'I'm Marcus Hale, Director of Internal Affairs, Department of Justice.' He didn't believe me. Or maybe he didn't care. "And your response?" the prosecutor asked. "I stayed still," Marcus said. "I followed protocol. I tried to de-escalate. I warned him. When I realized my life was in danger, I disarmed him and waited for backup." There was no anger in his voice, but there was something stronger. A deep, unflinching steadiness. He wasn't there to perform. He was there to remember. When the prosecutor asked what he believed would have happened had he not revealed his identity, Marcus paused. "He'd have shot me," he said. And no one would have asked why until it was too late. When Ortega took the stand the following day, she carried a different energy, leaner, sharper, a precise voice shaped by years of speaking too carefully and now freed to speak fully. She testified with the weight of documentation behind her, the internal complaints she had seen redirected, the suppression of IA reports, the deletion logs she had matched to suspicious use of force entries. She walked the court through the digital paper trail like a tour guide in a house built to conceal its flaws. "The system knew about Renner," she said clearly, "and it didn't care, because exposing one officer would have unraveled too many others." She pointed to the names on the list Marcus had recovered. She described how overrides were routed to specific terminals. She even identified the unusual login activity on the night Hale's files disappeared. "They didn't lose the footage," she said. "They erased it." "Why you?" the prosecutor asked. "Why speak up?" Ortega hesitated for the first time, then answered, "Because for years I told myself I was helping by staying inside, but I was just keeping it afloat." Devon was different. When he stepped forward, dressed in a plain button-up and stiff slacks he clearly didn't enjoy wearing, there was a tremor in his voice, but not one of weakness. It was the sound of someone who had never expected to be a witness to history, and still showed up anyway. He spoke softly at first, describing what made him take out his phone, the way Renner's tone had shifted, the way Marcus had stayed calm, even when the barrel was drawn. "I kept recording," he said, "because something felt off, and once the gun came out, I knew this wasn't going to be another warning. This was going to be something else." He described what happened after, the threats in his DMs, the strangers outside his job, the flash drive someone sent to his mother's house. "They wanted me to delete it," he said, finally looking directly at the jury. "But I couldn't, because if I did, who would believe what we all saw?" When asked what he felt that night, he took a long pause. "I felt like I was filming the last moments of a man's life," he said, "and I was just hoping it didn't end that way." Then Maya Hale took the stand, and the courtroom changed. She didn't walk in like a witness. She walked in like someone who had already fought a war outside the courtroom and brought its evidence with her. Her presence was not theatrical. It was grounded, unshaken. She opened her laptop without prompting and connected it to the overhead screen with the ease of someone who knew the truth would not wait. What followed was a forensic unraveling. Maya walked the court through time codes and metadata, matching the known elements of Devon's footage to expected intervals from the cruiser's dashcam system. She demonstrated how a 2-minute blackout in the official archive coincided precisely with the moment Renner stepped out of his vehicle. "This isn't a glitch," she said, her voice even but edged. "It's a deletion, coordinated, deliberate, and traceable." "Could this have been an automatic failure?" the defense asked. "Only if you believe a department-recorded body camera chooses to stop working whenever an officer crosses the line." The gallery didn't stir. They didn't need to. The data was speaking now. After Maya's testimony, there was no air left in the room for argument. Only the inevitable. But the prosecution still had one more card to play. On the 9th day, they got it. Renner took the stand late in the afternoon, the sky outside darkening as clouds clustered overhead like an omen. He raised his right hand, took the oath with a flat tone, and sat beneath the lights, pale under the weight of what was now undeniable. "I did my job," Renner said, his voice measured, rehearsed. "I followed department protocols based on perceived threat. I did not act with bias, nor did I intend harm." The prosecutor, a seasoned woman named Hartwell with years of trial work behind her, stepped forward calmly. "Officer Renner, is it your sworn testimony that you believed Mr. Marcus Hale posed a threat to you during that stop?" "I didn't know who he was," Renner replied. "He was evasive, refused to provide ID at first. His behavior was erratic." Hartwell raised an eyebrow. "You're saying the director of internal affairs was erratic?" "I didn't know he was the director," Renner snapped. "He only said it after I'd already drawn my weapon." "And when he said it, what was your response?" "I thought he was lying." Hartwell paused, then retrieved a printed exhibit from the desk. "In your original report, you stated, and I quote, 'The subject refused to provide credentials and appeared agitated, muttering legal phrases under his breath.' Would you agree that's an accurate transcription?" Renner squinted. "That's what I remember." Director Hale never raised his voice in the video. He never refused. He stated his name, his title, and offered you his credentials from his jacket. That moment occurs 36 seconds before your weapon was drawn. Are you still saying he only said it after? Renner shifted in the chair. "If I got the sequence wrong, it's because of the stress. Things move fast in the field. So you were mistaken." Yes, I may have misremembered the timing." Hartwell nodded slowly, not to comfort, but to let the words hang in the air. "Earlier," she continued, "you testified that your body cam was recording, but records show your cruiser's onboard dashcam was active upon ignition, then deactivated manually at 18:03. That's nearly a full minute before you approached Mr. Hale's car. Were you aware the camera had been turned off?" "I didn't turn it off," Renner said, his voice harder now. "I never touched it. And yet the dashcam was stopped at the source. There's no footage. And you were the only one in the vehicle." Renner hesitated. "There could have been a glitch." Hartwell turned to the jury. "According to department records, that dashcam was serviced and tested 2 days earlier. Fully functional." "I can't answer for every malfunction," Renner said, growing defensive. "I was focused on the situation." "Focused?" Hartwell echoed, stepping closer. "On a man who was seated, calm, compliant, and stating his legal status as your superior." "I didn't feel safe," he replied tightly. "You didn't feel safe," she repeated, lifting the printed still of Renner with his weapon raised, his face twisted in aggression. "But you felt in control." Renner looked down. "Officer Renner," Hartwell said, her tone sharpening just slightly, "did you tell a former trainee in 2022 that you pull over any black man who looks out of place?" His eyes snapped back up. "That's a lie. We have the statement on record. Sworn. Delivered by a woman who rode with you 3 times. She misunderstood me," She quoted you directly. Renner opened his mouth, then closed it again. Hartwell didn't push further. She didn't need to. Thank you, she said, stepping back. No further questions. The defense tried to regain footing, asking Renner about his years of service, his commendations, his disciplinary record, but each answer sounded thinner than the last, his words stripped of context by what had already been laid bare. The contradictions weren't just verbal, they were structural. The man the department once called decisive now looked evasive. The man who claimed to follow protocol now appeared cornered by his own falsified reports. And when the defense sat down, the courtroom sat in silence again. Not out of shock, but understanding. On the 10th day, closing arguments were made. And on the 12th, the verdict arrived. Guilty, on all counts. Assault with a deadly weapon, attempted manslaughter, obstruction of justice, falsification of law enforcement records. Renner showed no emotion as the sentence was read. The only movement came from his lawyer, who leaned in to whisper something unheard, and from the guards who stepped forward with cuffs. He didn't resist. He didn't look at the crowd. As he was escorted out the side door, he kept his eyes on the floor, walking as if hoping no one would remember that he had once stood with his gun pointed at a man who never raised his voice. Marcus stood quietly in the back row, Maya's hand resting in his. He didn't smile. There was no triumph, only a quiet release. A breath finally exhaled after too long held tight. Justice had spoken, and this time it didn't ask for permission. The trial had ended, but the echoes of it continued to ring through every hallway of city power. Even before the official sentencing hearing was scheduled, the fallout had already begun reshaping the way power functioned. What started as a courtroom reckoning had forced itself into policy chambers and government floors that had once managed to avoid uncomfortable questions. Now, those questions sat at the top of every agenda. The city council met under urgent resolution just 2 weeks after the verdict. In a rare unanimous decision, they voted to implement a package of sweeping reforms, the kind that had long been delayed beneath layers of political caution and procedural excuses. But the trial had shifted something. The public was no longer willing to wait. Too many eyes had seen too much. The first reform created an independent civilian oversight board with full access to departmental records, subpoena power, and the authority to launch investigations without police approval. Members would be elected by community zones, not appointed from within political or departmental channels. It was a wall broken down. The second mandated automatic disciplinary reviews for every use of force incident. No exceptions, no delays. Each review would be logged in a public database, accessible to media, legal watchdogs, and families of victims. It removed the protective cloak of delay and forced accountability into the light. The third, and perhaps most symbolic, was the passing of the real-time upload mandate, requiring all officer body cam and dash cam footage to be uploaded to secure servers within 60 seconds of deactivation. It meant no more erasures, no more technical errors. The truth, from now on, would be harder to hide. The officers' union, long known for its deep roots and political reach, pushed back hard. Statements were issued condemning reactionary legislation, painting officers as victims of shifting political winds. Behind closed doors, they lobbied council members. They organized rallies. They leaned on long-standing relationships and whispered about the dangers of handcuffed policing. But it wasn't enough. They leaned on long-standing relationships and whispered about the dangers of handcuffed policing. But it wasn't enough. The pressure had become a tide, and for the first time in a long time, the tide wasn't turning away. Marcus watched it all from a distance, not out of fear, but out of weariness. He had no desire to be a mascot or a permanent symbol. He gave a brief interview after the reforms were passed, thanking those who had stepped forward, acknowledging the families who had come before him, and then politely stepped back from the spotlight. He returned to his house, to Maya, to the sound of morning news filtered through the soft hum of a coffee maker, and to the quiet work of rebuilding a life he hadn't realized had been slowly taken apart until it stood in front of him in pieces. But there was still one piece left unfinished. It had lingered with him since the trial. The part of him that still wondered, despite everything, who Cole Renner really was behind the uniform, behind the bravado, behind the decisions that had nearly taken his life. Not out of sympathy, and certainly not out of guilt, but out of the need for finality. So he asked for a visit. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. There were no reporters, no press briefings, just a quiet phone call to the DA's office and a scheduled time slot at the county holding facility. Renner had not yet been transferred to state prison. He was still in limbo, awaiting formal sentencing. Marcus arrived alone. The room was cold and colorless, the kind of institutional sterility that dulled every sound and flattened the light. A steel table separated them, with scratches etched into the surface from hundreds of conversations that had gone nowhere. Renner sat already waiting, his posture slouched, eyes still sharp, but dulled around the edges. He wore the orange uniform with a forced nonchalance, but the crease in his brow betrayed the truth. This was a man no longer in control. Marcus sat across from him and said nothing at first. Renner was the one who broke the silence. "So you came to gloat?" he asked, his voice hoarse from days of disuse. "No," Marcus replied. "I came to understand." Renner scoffed, shaking his head. "Understand what? That you threw away your whole career just to play hero?" "I didn't throw it away," Marcus said. "I gave it meaning. You think any of this changes the street?" Renner leaned forward now, arms on the table. "You think policies and paperwork stop bullets? You think oversight boards are going to walk into a domestic call and tell a guy with a knife to sit down and be reasonable?" "I think people deserve better than fear," Marcus said calmly. "And I think the badge is supposed to serve the people, not protect those who use it as a weapon." Renner's jaw tightened. "You don't know what it's like. Out there. Every day. One wrong move and—" "You made the wrong move," Marcus interrupted, but his voice didn't rise. "And you made it more than once." There was a pause then, a long one. Finally, Renner leaned back and looked away, toward the tiny slit of a window where daylight tried to seep through. "I did what I had to," he muttered. "That's what we're trained to do." "No," Marcus said quietly. "That's what you were allowed to believe." Renner didn't respond. Marcus stood slowly. He didn't offer a goodbye. He didn't offer forgiveness. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said under oath. But as he walked toward the door, he paused just once, his hand resting against the metal frame. "You could have admitted it," he said without turning. "You still can." Renner didn't answer. And Marcus didn't wait. He left in silence, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click. Outside, the air was clear again. The city had not healed, not yet, but it had begun to breathe differently, like something inside it had been loosened, stirred, broken open just enough to let the light in. The city didn't erupt in celebration, nor did it pretend that justice had resolved everything overnight. There were no fireworks, no sudden parades through the streets, no declarations carved into banners that draped across City Hall. What followed instead was something more enduring, something quieter and harder to capture in headlines. It was the sound of a collective exhale, of doors opening a little wider in neighborhoods long held in the grip of distrust, of officers walking their beats beneath the weight of new expectations, and of conversations once held in whispers, now being spoken plainly, unapologetically, in rooms that had finally been forced to listen. The movement born from Marcus Hale's refusal to remain silent didn't end with the verdict or the resignation of those who once held unchecked power. It evolved, reshaping the very systems that had allowed silence to thrive. Meetings, once filled with procedural jargon, now carried urgency. Policy briefings no longer began with how to preserve public image, but with how to restore public trust. Not everyone welcomed the change, and resistance still lingered in corners too comfortable with the old way. But the city had already begun moving forward, and the ones clinging to the past could no longer slow it down. For Marcus, the aftermath arrived not as a wave of public attention, but as a gentle retreat back into something grounded. He did not return to the halls of oversight, or accept the flood of offers extended by advocacy organizations, academic panels, or legal institutions eager to claim him as a symbol of integrity. Instead, he chose something smaller, something quieter, but in many ways more lasting. In a modest brick building that once served as a mechanic's garage just south of the river, he opened a training center dedicated to the one thing his career had taught him mattered most: ethical policing rooted not in fear or dominance, but in service and responsibility. There were no fluorescent lights or corporate slogans etched into glass, just one white sign, painted by hand and affixed above the entrance, where the sunlight could strike it each morning. It read, simply, ethics, justice, service, accountability, the pillars he had always believed should guide those who wore a badge, and now taught to anyone willing to relearn what the badge was meant to represent. The space was open not just to new recruits or current officers, but to civilians, activists, and those who had been harmed by the system. Inside those walls, there was no rank, only the willingness to listen, to challenge assumptions, and to leave with a clearer understanding of the weight that authority must carry. Marcus taught 2 evenings a week, never with theatrics or fanfare, but with deliberate care. He asked hard questions. He left room for silence. He made space for discomfort. He watched young officers sit in quiet reckoning as they re-examined procedures they had accepted without question, and he guided them, not with condemnation, but with clarity, toward a deeper sense of responsibility. Maya, too, found herself stepping into a broader legacy. Though she had always been a force in her own right, the trial had illuminated her voice, and across the state, doors opened that once would have remained shut. She took on civil rights cases with a fierce, meticulous drive that had become her hallmark. Landlords who had denied housing based on last names. Schools that over-disciplined black students without due process. Police departments still resisting oversight in smaller counties where cameras rarely turned. She fought each case not for recognition, but because she understood the cost of inaction. And she brought that same quiet intensity home at night, not weighed down by what she carried, but fueled by the knowledge that change, when seeded honestly, would always bloom. Devin Knox, once just a young man with a phone and a split-second instinct, had found his own rhythm amid the noise. He declined every brand deal, every attempt to turn him into a face on a poster, and instead walked back into the communities that had shaped him, not to lecture, but to build. With help from local partners and a modest grant secured through the mayor's office, he helped establish See It Through, a program that offered young people a space to learn not only about their rights, but how to document injustice, how to tell their own stories, and how to engage with systems without losing themselves to them. His workshops became a steady pulse through the neighborhoods, quiet, consistent, and honest. He never called himself an activist, but people did, and he never argued with them. And then there was Ortega. When the governor formally announced her appointment as the new commissioner of the department, there was no parade, no handshake ceremony with staged applause. There was only expectation, and the long shadow of a department that had shielded its worst for far too long. But Ortega walked into the role not with promises, but with policy. She restructured the complaint intake system. She cleared out desk drawers that had held ignored reports for years. She appointed civilians to her advisory board and required her officers to sit across from those civilians every month and explain their metrics face to face. She didn't make sweeping speeches. She didn't offer comfort to those who resisted the change. She worked late, answered directly, and made sure her badge meant what it was supposed to mean. And somewhere in that city still healing, still learning, still trying to understand itself again, Marcus found moments of stillness. He walked without the weight of secrecy. He spoke without wondering who might try to twist his words. He returned, slowly, to the man he had always tried to be. Before the badge, before the testimony, before the weapon pointed at his chest, had forced the world to decide what it truly believed. On a quiet evening, just past dusk, he stood at the front of the training center after dismissing a class of young cadets. The parking lot was emptying. The lights above hummed low. Inside, the whiteboard still bore the words he had written at the beginning of the session. What is the purpose of your authority? He didn't erase it. He left it there. Not for himself, but for the ones who would come after him. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.